I'm Eli. This is my project on No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai for my senior English class. This book is very important and it's a very good read. I did enjoy reading it a whole lot. It is based on a true story. A lot of the bad things that happen to real people, and the author uses a stand-in for himself in this book, so it's sort of autobiographical. In this video essay podcast, I'm going to explain the plot of No Longer Human, give a character analysis of Yozo and why he is the way he is, because, spoiler, the book is named after him. I believe the best place to start with this plot analysis is the prologue, and it starts with three pictures of the man. One where he is very young, one in his teenage years, and one where he has gray hair. And the first one is calling the boy ugly, despite him being a very cute child, because he has a very evil smirk on his face. And it's almost uncanny how visceral the man looks. It's described as it looks like he has a horse's head, just because he looks like an animal. He doesn't look like a human. The second picture describes him as very handsome, but his face fails explicably to give the impression of belonging to a living human being. He wears a student's uniform and a white handkerchief peeks from his breast pocket. He sits in a wicker chair with his legs crossed. Again, he's smiling, but this time not the wizened monkey grin, but rather an adroit little smile. And yet, somehow, it is not the smile of a human being. It utterly lacks substance. All of what we might call the heaviness of blood, or perhaps the solidity of human life. In the third picture, he is described to have small hands and that he doesn't have an expression at all. He's been jaded and he's not a human, but in a different way to the other two pictures, in a way that he's way more experienced, and it's almost more terrifying than the other two pictures. After the prologue, it goes into the first notebook. This notebook describes his early life and the struggles he dealt with very young. There's three notebooks in this text, and the second one is more his high school, college years, and the third notebook is much later in his life. Yozo as a child dealt with a lot. He was abused by wait staff, by a bunch of different people, and he lived in this huge mansion because his father was a great politician and his mother also had a good job. But he learned from a very young age that he couldn't trust humans. He couldn't trust society, as he calls it. And he was either utterly terrified or unwilling to build a connection with people. So what does he do? He starts what he calls clowning, which he just makes himself a jester or a clown. He just tells jokes, makes people laugh, because he believes if he does that, people won't look deeper and they won't want to build a further connection with him. On top of his clowning, he also got a lot of people pleasing behaviors because he was afraid of what would happen if a human didn't get their way. He didn't know what would come next, so he just always went along with what the people wanted. One instance of this people pleasing behavior that he remembers is his father was going to Tokyo and he wanted to bring back gifts for his kids. So what happened was he offered him a lion mask, and he was writing in a notebook all the things that he was going to get his kids. And Yozo didn't want a lion mask, and he ended up convincing his father to not get one. But out of fear of what might happen, he went into the notebook in the night and wrote lion mask in there because he was afraid of what his father might do if he didn't get what he wanted. Eventually, Yozo goes to high school, and he's continued his clowning for so long that it's just part of him now. And one of the kids in his class finally catches on, and it's one of the kids that he thought never had higher intelligence, I guess, which is really mean, but he never saw them as a worthy person of his time. So when he calls him out, he's taken aback because he fell on the floor on purpose to make people laugh, and the kid like taps him on the shoulder and goes, "I know you did that on purpose," and he's mortified. The kid's name was Takaichi, and this was the first time someone saw through Yozo. And this is one of the strongest emotions that Yozo feels through the book, more than hunger, more than sadness. He feels this primal fear because someone was able to see through his clowning. So, what does Yozo do? Well, he has two options. He can either make Takaichi a friend, or he can pray that he dies. And for the first time in the story, Yozo grows close to somebody, or as close as you can be when the other option is killing somebody. Um, Eventually, Yozo moves in with two of his very distant cousins, and one of them asks him to run away together. And around this same time, Yozo gets really into art. Takaichi shows him a portrait of Vincent van Gogh, and he wants to become a painter. And then Takaichi says something very important. These are pictures of ghosts, and this inspires Yozo so much that he wants to start painting pictures of ghosts too. Takaichi also describes these paintings as horses from hell, and not Takaichi, Yozo sees this as an opportunity to paint the monsters that he sees every day in humanity. Yozo's father, after high school, makes him go to a normal college despite Yozo wanting to go to an art school. And he ends up skipping classes and taking art classes on the side so that he can paint these pictures of humanity. He ends up making friends with a kid named Hariki, and eventually he asks him for money, and then Yozo gives him the money, and then later on he asks them to go drinking, which is a problem because for the rest of the story, Yozo becomes a heavy alcoholic. Yozo becomes an alcoholic because this fear of humanity that has plagued his entire life is gone when he's drunk, when he's hammered. And he falls into a cycle of drinking and skipping class, and eventually he loses interest in a career altogether. Eventually, Yozo gets introduced to another vice, prostitution, and he doesn't see these women as people, which normally would be a bad thing, but he's not afraid of these women. And he's always admired the female form, which is a weird thing to say, but he's always admired the female form. And he has always been terrified of actually building a connection, so now he can admire the female form and indulge in it and not build a connection. Eventually, Hariki also introduced them to a third thing, the Communist Party. During this time period, Japan in like the 20s to the 30s and later 40s, communism was illegal, and you would be put in jail until you retracted your statements on communism. And Yozo thought this was really stupid. He didn't like going to these underground communist meetings, but he did like doing things he wasn't supposed to do. Something remarkable about this is his people-pleasing tendency gets him really far in these underground meetings, because they'd ask him to do something and he'd just do it. So he ended up ascending the ranks of this underground communist party, despite him not liking the idea of communism at all. Because Yozo doesn't have a job and he's dropping out of all these colleges, his dad used to give him an allowance, but now that he's dropped out of all of his classes, his dad has withdrawn his allowance and now he can't buy alcohol. Eventually, when he's on his last dime, he stumbles into a bar very, very drunk, and he explains to the waiter that he doesn't have any money, but he wants to drink. And the waiter goes, "Okay, it's on the house." The waiter's name was Tsuneko, and eventually, when he drinks himself basically blind and he can't return home, she takes him back to her place and takes care of him. Tsuneko explains to Yozo that her husband has been in jail for a very long time, and she seems to have lost her purpose. And for the first time, Yozo builds a real connection with somebody that isn't people pleasing or out of fear of what might happen. Eventually, Hariki and Yozo go back into the same restaurant or bar that she worked at, and Hariki says he is so hungry for a woman that he's going to kiss whoever serves them. And who else serves him but the woman from the night before? Hariki takes one look at her and goes, "You're destitute, you're ugly, and you're sad. I'm not kissing you." Yozo, seeing this, being another lonely, destitute, sad person, ends up being drawn closer to Tsuneko, and he spends the night with her once again. And eventually, Tsuneko says that she wants to die. And Yozo goes, "I'll join you, let's do it." Eventually, they head to the coast with plans to jump in the water, and they do. Tsuneko leaves a sash next to a rock, Yozo leaves his jacket, and Tsuneko dies. And Yozo was saved. Because Yozo's father was very prominent as a politician, this story was featured everywhere, and Yozo was facing charges of assisting with Tsuneko's suicide. Eventually, Yozo accidentally cuts himself while being interrogated by the police. The police walk in, and he coughs into the same napkin, and the police sees the little bit of blood and asks, "Dude, are you, like, coughing up blood?" And what happens is Yozo says yes, not in an attempt to get away with what he did, but because he was so afraid of what might happen if he said no. He ends up faking this cough in front of everybody, and then when he gets to the district attorney, he fakes the cough, and he goes, "Was that real?" And immediately he's sent back to school where he was caught faking the jump and falling on the ground. Eventually, Yozo is put into the custody of a man called Flatfish, or that's what his family calls him, and he is essentially kept as a prisoner-ish. Like, he gets food, he gets water, but he can't go anywhere, he can't do what he wants to do. And eventually Flatfish just asks, "What did you want to do?" And he goes, "I wanted to be a painter." And Flatfish brushes him off. After Yozo has had enough of being stuck with Flatfish, he goes to escape to go see Hariki again, his drinking buddy. And Hariki wants nothing to do with him because being with Yozo is heavily stigmatized after what he attempted, you know. And eventually another woman comes in the room and falls head over heels for Yozo because at this point in his life he's conventionally attractive. The lady's name was Shizuko, and eventually she invites him to stay with her at their place with their daughter. And Yozo, really opens up to the daughter because he believes that kids are less jaded and evil humans than adults. Eventually, Yozo starts drawing like manga, which is like comics, for her newspaper, and it goes pretty well. Eventually, this manga does good enough in the newspaper that he can afford his own alcohol, and that's still all he really cares about. But Hariki says that he should marry the woman that he's staying with because an unmarried man who's an alcoholic living with an unmarried woman who has a daughter, not a good look in Japan. Eventually, Yozo is talking with Shigeko's daughter, and she asks Yozo if he believes in a god and prayer and speaking to God. And Yozo says, "I don't believe that I'm worthy of speaking to God." And he asks her daughter, "What would you pray for?" And she goes, "I want my real dad back." And immediately, Yozo is filled with this shock and pain because this person that he thought he could trust and these kids that he thought he could not be with, that doesn't sound right, but these kids that he feel like he could trust and aren't cruel and evil like normal humans, showed that same cruelty as adults. With the money he gets from writing manga, he goes out drinking, and even still, that's not enough money for his vices. So he ends up pawning off Shinjuku's clothes and making the money from that to go drink. Eventually, the woman and the child, after a long day of drinking, he gets home and hears them behind the door, and he hears them talking about, well, why is what the daughter now calls daddy drinking so much? And he realizes he's ruining this family's happiness, and he decides to leave without saying goodbye. Jokingly, Yozo says, "If I stop drinking, you gotta marry me, though." And Yoshiko says yes, because she's very trusting. And it ends up becoming like a promise. I'll stop drinking, you marry me. The next day he gets drunk. The next day. And he goes up to her and he's like, well, deal's off, I got drunk. And she's like, no, you didn't. You didn't get drunk. There's no way you would have broken the pinky promise we just made. So they get married. And he's in a state of just being okay. He's not in love, but he's not terribly miserable. So he's all right. Eventually, Hariki comes over and they decide to get drunk on the apartment roof. So they go up there, and then Hariki gets hungry. So he goes downstairs and he sees something terrible. He goes up and tells Yozo, he's like, come down here right now, look at this. This is insane. He comes down, he looks through this little peephole, and he sees his wife getting sexually assaulted. For lack of a better word, Yozo's like twisted brain looked at this very logically, and he was like, that's humanity. Yep. He was paralyzed and he didn't do anything. He was just like, dang. Animals do what animals do. Eventually, Yozo runs upstairs, not doing anything to help her, and passes out on the roof. And Yoshiko, who was just assaulted, is up there holding a platter of beans. And is like, hey, you good down there, man? They said they wouldn't do anything. And then they did. And then Yozo's like, you're way too trusting of people. Because Yozo, the alcoholic, communist leader, cigarette user, all the things, has the authority to say something like that to her and to victim blame her. Eventually, Yoshiko buys some sleeping pills, and Yozo, seeing this, being a depressed, alcoholic, smoker, good-for-nothing human being, essentially, tries to overdose on them, and he survives. He wakes up surrounded by Flatfish, Yoshiko, and Hariki, and Flatfish is like, dude, this is the second time you've done this. You need to, like, do something. So he gives him some money to go to the mountains to have a detox. And what happens is he blows it all on alcohol. And during this bender, he starts coughing up blood. And he goes to a pharmacist who he sees the same sadness in himself as he does in her. Very similar to the last woman that he tried to commit suicide with. And she says, oh, my husband started coughing up blood and then he died. So he gives him a bunch of medication. She gives him a bunch of medication. And one of those is morphine. Eventually, he gets addicted to morphine because he calls it better than alcohol. It's like he's productive. It's like Adderall for him. And he ends up going from like 1 needle a day to 4 to 5. And he ends up sleeping with his pharmacist to get even more morphine. And he ends up very broke. And what happens is he decides, I'm going to send a letter to my dad. If he doesn't send me money, I'm going to kill myself. His dad doesn't reply. So he decides on a day to do it. And then on that day, Hariki and Flatfish miraculously show up, go, dude, you have a morphine addiction and you're going to try to kill yourself again. We're sending you to a mental hospital. At this mental hospital facility thing, Yoshiko brings him a change of clothes, and in the clothes is a needle, a morphine needle, because she still, after all of this, because she's very trusting, she's very naive, believes that he still needs it. For the first time, or one of the first times in Yozo's life, he goes, I'm going to pass on the vice. And that is also huge because of his people-pleasing tendency. He passes on it because he's so connected to Yoshiko at this point and trusting in her. Now is a good time to say that this book's title is a quote from the book, but specifically the Japanese translation of the book. In this sanitarium, mental hospital thing, there's some lines where he's like, I'm either a madman or a social reject. Either way, I'm disqualified from being a human being. And that translated from Japanese to English gave us the title of this book. When Yozo gets out of the hospital, his brother comes and tells him that his father has passed away, and now his brother, a successful politician, says, listen, man, if you move out to the countryside where there's no bars, cigarettes, women, morphine, more women, that he will pay for the rest of his life. And he agrees to this, and he lives out with his days with an elderly woman who doesn't care about his charm or his good looks or his people-pleasing tendency, and he lives neither happy or unhappy, but he just lives the rest of his life out in the countryside. This might sound crazy, but at the end of this book, Yozo is only 27, which is why at the start of the book, his age in the third picture was very hard to pin down. Because he's 27, but he has gray hair, he looks over 40, he looks disheveled and old, and he's just experienced and a recovered druggie and a failed human being. Now, if I didn't say that this was an autobiography at the start, you wouldn't have known this until the epilogue, where the woman who ran the bar that the apartment complex was on top of, where they met Yoshiko, kept the notebooks and pictures of Yozo, who lived above it, and gave it to the author to publish in their entirety, which is now the story No Longer Human. After a short conversation between the author and the barkeeper, it says that it's his father's fault. If Yozo didn't drink, or even if he did, he was a good boy or an angel. And that's how No Longer Human ends. I literally have goosebumps right now. This book was incredible. I like it almost as much as I liked Blood Meridian, which is my favorite book of all time. But this is probably, whereas Blood Meridian is the most gruesome story I've ever read, this is probably the saddest and most dark book I've ever read. It's really telling of a lot of terrible things, and I believe this story is so important it needs to be told. The author of this book, Osamu Dazai, if the story couldn't get any worse, was a man who had a morphine addiction, was an alcoholic, smoked cigarettes, tried to take his life 3 times and ended up successfully doing it once. And this book is autobiographical, kind of a commentary on that. And boy, is that hard. Character analysis for this book is kind of difficult because of how easy it is in a way, except for Yozo. Yozo is someone who was abused, who suffered from all of these vices. But at the end of the book, he's still called an angel. And though he's watched terrible things happen, he's done terrible things to people, it's very hard to call him a bad person. Yoshiko, for example, you could just describe her as naive, brush her off. Hariki, he's an artist who's an alcoholic, you could blow that off. But Yozo is so hard to pin down, and I think that's part of what makes this story amazing. Because No Longer Human is not a story about Yozo anymore. When you do some digging, it's about Osamu Dazai. And it's easy to call a storybook character evil, but it's so hard to call a normal human being evil. I think that's where I'm going to end this video essay podcast assignment thing. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give me a good grade, Miss Boyd.